In 1912, Violet Jessop survived the sinking of the Titanic. She was 23 years old and working as a stewardess when the ship hit the iceberg. And she climbed into lifeboat number 16, holding a baby that wasn't hers, while the unsinkable ship went down behind her. 4 years later, she was hired as a nurse on the Britannic, the Titanic's sister ship. And when it hit a mine in the Aegean Sea and started sinking, she was one of the last people off. She survived that too. And before both of those disasters, she had been working on the Olympic when it collided with a warship and nearly went down in 1911. 3 ships, 3 disasters. One woman who walked away from all of them without so much as a scratch. But what Violet Jessop saw in those final moments on each ship, what she noticed that nobody else seemed to catch, was something she kept utterly quiet about for decades. And when she finally spoke about it years later, what she said about those 3 disasters changed everything people thought they knew about the White Star Line. Violet Constance Jessop was born in Argentina in 1887 to Irish immigrant parents who had moved to South America looking for a better life. Her father worked on a sheep farm and her mother ran a small boarding house. And Violet grew up speaking both English and Spanish fluently in a household that was deeply devout and remarkably poor. When she was 16, her father died from complications related to his work, and her mother moved the family back to England to be closer to relatives and to find steadier employment. Her mother found work as a stewardess on ocean liners, which in the early 1900s was one of the few respectable jobs available to working-class women who needed to support families on their own. Violet watched her mother board ships for weeks at a time and come home exhausted, and she promised herself she would find different work, something that didn't require leaving home for long stretches, while her younger siblings needed her. She was horribly wrong about how that would turn out. When Violet was in her early 20s, her mother became too ill to continue working, and the family desperately needed income. Violet applied to the Royal Mail Line as a stewardess, lying about her age and her experience, and she was hired almost immediately. The work was exactly as grueling as her mother had described. Stewardesses worked 18-hour days, cleaning cabins, serving meals, attending to passengers, and sleeping in tiny, cramped quarters below deck. The pay was modest. The conditions were punishing. But Violet was supporting her family, and she was good at the work in a way that surprised even her. In 1910, she transferred to the White Star Line, which operated the largest and most luxurious ocean liners in the world. She was assigned to the RMS Olympic, the flagship of the fleet, a massive ship that was being called the most advanced vessel ever built. Violet boarded the Olympic in 1911 for what she thought would be a routine transatlantic crossing. It was not routine. On September 20th, 1911, the Olympic was leaving Southampton when it collided with a British warship called the HMS Hawke. The impact was severe enough that both ships were badly damaged, and the Olympic had to limp back to port for repairs that would take weeks. Nobody was killed, but Violet later said the experience left her deeply shaken, not because of the collision itself, but because of what she heard in the hours immediately after. The officers were whispering, the crew was nervous, and the passengers who had been promised the safest voyage in history on the most advanced ship in the world was suddenly being ushered off with apologies and assurances that everything was fine, when it very clearly was not. Violet noticed something else too. The damage to the Olympic was extensive, far more extensive than the White Star Line publicly admitted, and the repairs were being done with a speed and secrecy that struck her as odd for a company that prided itself on transparency. She kept working. She needed the money, but she filed away what she had seen: the hurry repairs, the nervous officers, the way the company downplayed the severity of the collision to the press. A year later, she will remember all of it. In 1912, Violet was offered a position on a brand new ship that the White Star Line was about to launch. It was called the Titanic. She hesitated. The Olympic collision had left her wary of these massive ships, and the company's assurances that they were unsinkable. But the pay was good, and her family still needed support. So she signed on as a stewardess and boarded the Titanic in Southampton on April 10th, 1912. The Titanic was extraordinary. Violet had worked on the Olympic and thought nothing could be more impressive. But the Titanic was something else entirely. The luxury, the size, the absolute confidence radiating from everyone on board that this ship was different, that this ship was special, that this ship could not sink. Violet wanted to believe it. She really did. On the night of April 14th, 4 days into the voyage, Violet was in her cabin when the ship hit the iceberg. She felt the collision, a strange scraping shudder that didn't seem particularly alarming at first, and she went up on deck to see what had happened. What she found was chaos that was being very carefully managed to look like calm. The officers were telling passengers to put on life jackets as a precaution. The crew was loading lifeboats in a way that seemed orderly, but was moving far too quickly for a precaution. And Violet, who had been through the Olympic collision just a year earlier, recognized the fear in the officers' eyes, even as they smiled and told everyone there was no reason to panic. She was ordered into lifeboat 16. As she was climbing in, one of the officers handed her a baby and told her to hold it. And she did, and she sat in that lifeboat in the freezing Atlantic night, holding someone else's child, while the Titanic, the unsinkable ship, slipped beneath the water 2.5 hours after hitting the iceberg. Over 1,500 people died that night. Violet Jessop was not one of them. When the survivors were brought to New York, Violet gave her account to investigators. She described the collision, the lifeboats, the baby that was handed to her and then taken back by a woman on the Carpathia who Violet never saw again. What she did not describe, what she kept to herself, was the conversation she had overheard between two officers in the hours before the ship went down. They had been talking about the Olympic, about the collision, about the repairs, and about how certain design flaws that had been identified after the Olympics accident had never been properly addressed before the Titanic launched because the schedule was too tight and the company needed the ship in service. She kept that to herself. She was 25 years old and she needed to work. And accusing the White Star Line of negligence in the middle of the biggest maritime disaster in history seemed like a very good way to ensure she never worked again. After the Titanic, Violet tried to find other work. She really did. But she was a stewardess, and that was the only skill she had that paid enough to support her family. So when the World War I broke out in 1914 and the White Star Line converted the Britannic, the Titanic's second sister ship, into a hospital ship, Violet signed on as a nurse. She told herself it would be different this time. The Britannic had been redesigned with additional safety features after the Titanic disaster. It was being used for a noble cause. It would be fine. On November 21st, 1916, the Britannic was sailing through the Aegean Sea, when it hit a mine. Violet was in her cabin when the explosion happened, and this time the panic was immediate. There was no careful management, no orderly evacuation. The ship was going down fast, far faster than the Titanic had, and Violet found herself on deck, watching crew members launch lifeboats in a chaotic scramble to get everyone off before the ship rolled. She jumped. She later said she had no choice. The lifeboat she was supposed to board had already been lowered, and there was no time to find another one. So she jumped into the water and was nearly killed when one of the Britannic's massive propellers, still spinning as the ship sank, came within feet of her head. She was pulled from the water by crew members in the lifeboat. 30 people died in the Britannic disaster. Violet Jessop, once again, was not one of them. This time, she asked questions. She wanted to know why the ship had sunk so quickly. She wanted to know if the redesigns after Titanic had actually been implemented, or if, like the Olympic repairs, they had been rushed and incomplete. The answers she got were vague and deeply unsatisfying, and Violet began to suspect something that she would not say out loud for another 50 years. After the Britannic, Violet kept working. She went back to the White Star Line and spent the next 25 years as a stewardess on various ships, never speaking publicly about what she had survived, or what she had overheard, or what she suspected about the company's safety practices. She was asked about the Titanic occasionally by passengers who recognized her name, and she would tell them polite, vague stories about the bravery of the crew and the tragedy of the loss, and nothing at all about the officers' whispered conversation, or the hurried Olympic repairs, or the way the Britannic had gone down so much faster than a redesigned ship should have. She retired in 1950 and moved to a small cottage in England, and for the next 20 years, she lived quietly, tending her garden and avoiding interviews, and keeping to herself the things she had seen and heard across 3 disasters that had killed over 1,500 people combined. She was in her 70s when a young maritime historian named John Maxstone Graham tracked her down and convinced her to speak on the record about her experiences. What she told him was careful and measured, and deeply, quietly damning. She described the Olympic collision and the rushed repairs. She described the officers in the Titanic discussing design flaws that had not been addressed. She described the Britannic sinking far faster than the safety redesigns should have allowed. And she said, very clearly, that she believed the White Star Line had prioritized speed and cost over safety across all 3 ships, and that the disasters were not acts of God or unforeseeable tragedies, but the inevitable result of a company cutting corners on vessels that were carrying thousands of lives. Violet Jessop died in 1971 at the age of 83. Her memoir, which included the details of what she had overheard and suspected across 50 years of silence, was not published until 1987, 26 years after her death. By then, most of the people who could have been held accountable were long gone, and the White Star Line itself had been absorbed into other companies decades earlier. The revelations in her memoir were largely ignored by the press. The Titanic had become a legend, a story about hubris and tragedy and the limits of human ambition. And the idea that it might also have been a story about corporate negligence and cost-cutting and corners cut on safety features did not fit the narrative that the world had spent 85 years building. But Violet Jessop had survived 3 disasters that killed over 1,500 people, and she had kept quiet about what she knew for most of her life, because she needed to work, and because accusing powerful men of negligence in the early 1900s was not something a working-class woman could do without consequences. She finally spoke. The world chose not to listen. If this story made you angry, a thumbs up helps more people to find it. Subscribe for more stories about the things that were buried and the people who tried to tell the truth anyway. Because Violet Jessop was very far from the only one.